What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge and welcome back to my Tree of Savior guide series. Today we are going to talk about the Cleric Archetype. Now here's a little disclaimer. Personally, I don't play healer classes. I'm not a healer player, and so I haven't really played a lot of Cleric, which is why the character in the background is only level 5 or 6. But I assure you that I'm not talking out of my ass. I have sat down with my buddy Calcifar, who is a healer player, a very dedicated healer player, who knows what he's talking about when it comes to healing, and who has done his homework when it comes to Tree of Savior. So while this is not specifically my personal knowledge, I have full confidence in everything I say here. So the first little difference to the swordsman is that with the cleric there are actually a couple of different things you have to keep in mind, and they are generally pertaining to stats. Whereas every single swordsman class benefits from strength, and the only deviation is how much you put in constitution, with the cleric there are a few different ways to go. You can either go strength for some of the physical builds out there, like monk or paladin. You could go for the more traditional intelligence route, which covers pretty much most of the other classes. And there are even some high spirit options, such as a full-out bow core or a triple priest chaplain build. Now I will say that not all of these classes are incredibly viable, and as a general rule I would say that intelligence builds are a little bit better, but that doesn't make the other ones completely unplayable. So before you start playing your cleric, you should figure out which of these ways you are most likely to go, because it will determine how you put your stats from the very beginning of making your character. Alright then, let us talk about Cleric Circle 1, the one every single cleric starts out with. First we have Heal, and Heal is of course an amazing fundamental ability. Every single cleric character should make use of Heal. I mean seriously, heal is always useful, whether you use it to do a bunch of damage or you use it to heal yourself and your party back up. Heal is just such a fundamental ability for the entire game really. Cure is another one of those abilities that you're just going to pick up because it's simply good damage in the early game, but it also gets double scaling from intelligence, which means if you go the intelligence route, Cure remains a very strong damage spell even up to the late game. Safety Zone is the second absolute bread and butter skill when it comes to cleric, and really every single cleric should make copious use of their safety zones. Being able to outright mitigate damage through the block system doesn't just save on healing, it can also just prevent immense amounts of burst damage by monsters. It is a very useful utility skill and not a single cleric should ever skip out on it. And lastly we have the Deprotected Zone, which isn't necessarily a bad skill, but it is just not quite as good as the other three skills. Cleric, unlike Swordsman, is just a class that has so many good skills that it's really not a case of this ability sucks, it's more that this ability just doesn't make the cut. However, if you go for a full spirit build, there is an argument to be made for Deprotected Zone because it does scale with spirit. And so it might make sense to put a couple more points into it. Now let's move on to rank 2, and I will say right away that the consensus, not just mine or Calcifar's, but in the community is that Cleric Circle 2 is probably your best choice no matter what build you go. And the reason for that is simple. Safety Zone is already a very good ability, and it gets even better if you go Cleric Circle 2. Heal is an outstanding ability that everyone needs, and it is just so much better if you go for Cleric Circle 2. So just because you can put 10 points in each of these abilities and unlock an additional attribute for Safety Zone that makes it almost twice as valuable, means that Cleric Circle 2 is just incredibly strong for the second rank. The first additional ability that you get is Divine Might, and even Divine Might is a strong ability. Now the description of this ability could be misunderstood, so let me explain. It increases the abilities that you use by 1 rank. So say for example you have 5 points invested in your heal. If you use Divine Might, your heal will be treated as though you had 6 points in it. And then increasing points in Divine Might just means that more subsequent uses of heal will be treated as though you had 6 points in it. So if you have 5 points in Divine Might, your heal isn't treated like it had 10 points in it, it is treated like it has 6 points in it, but for the next 5 uses of heal. So basically Divine Might is really just a basic damage increase for the group. By buffing everyone's abilities for 1 rank, you simply have a small damage increase for a certain amount of time. It is not a bad ability, but depending on the build, you could argue whether or not you want to put more points in Divine Might, or if 1 point is maybe enough just for that little burst you need at some points, and then invest the remaining points into Cure. Because as I said earlier, Cure remains really good way up into the late game, and getting more hits out of Cure could be what you want to do, especially if you're going for a bit more of a damage focused build. So it's really more of a personal choice whether or not you want to be able to do more damage or if you want more group utility. And then lastly we have Fade, which is an incredibly good defensive skill. However, the only thing that gets better with Fade is the duration. And all you really want from Fade is for it to reset your aggro. And it always does that, so it's really not worth investing more than 1 point into it. Now next on rank 2 we have Priest. And for Priest there is a very simple rule. Either you go 1 rank in Priest or you go 3 ranks in Priest. Don't ever try to have a build that has 2 ranks in Priest, cause it's just not worth it. The fact of the matter is Sacrament, just like Gung Ho and Concentrate on the Swordsman, lose out on value later on in the game because it only works on basic attacks, and basic attacks just aren't really all that common and really are no longer the focus as soon as you reach 150 levels or higher. And so the reasons to pick up Priest are in rank 1 and in rank 3. I'm not going to talk majorly about Priest rank 3 because obviously that is not the focus of this specific guide, but let me just say, if you want to go for Priest Circle 3, what you are going for is Stone Skin. Stone Skin is what your character is going to do because it is a very powerful ability. So when you are going Priest Circle 3, you should absolutely plan to also go Chaplain, and you're focusing your character on Stone Skin, which means you might want to think about focusing your character on Spirit. I will probably have a build guide at some point for the Chaplain class, and I will reiterate why this is in that guide. But for now, let's look at Priest Circle 1. So we have Aspersion, which is a pretty decent defense buff. The damage isn't all that amazing, but it's still viable, I guess. But the real problem with Aspersion, as it is with a lot of buffs in the Cleric archetype, is that it can be provided by a Pardoner. So if your build doesn't include Pardoner, these buffs tend to lose a little bit of value because you can just have the group pick them up if you really need those buffs. Next we have Monster, and it's another ability that is slightly weirdly worded, and how it works is that you put a magic circle on the ground, and that magic circle is what causes the defense debuff on the enemies. However, the dexterity buff happens on your group the moment you cast the spell, so your group doesn't actually have to run through the magic circle. This makes the ability a little bit more useful, but in the end it's still not that great of an ability. Especially when you think about the buff limit that does tend to rear its ugly head. Next we have Blessing, and Blessing is definitely a really good ability. It adds a good portion of damage and even adds this damage to abilities unlike Sacrament or Concentrate. It is an incredibly useful ability early game, and if you choose to go Priest Circle 1, then it is going to make your leveling a whole lot easier, and it is also not useless later on. But do remember that Cleric Circle 2 just is very good. And lastly we have the reason to get Priest Circle 1, and that is Resurrection. Being able to revive your group at any time is incredibly valuable in a game where you drop all of your gems upon dying. Especially later in the game, dying is very punishing. In some dungeons, if you die, you can't actually join the dungeon again, so everybody has just 1 life, if you will, and the only way of circumventing that is Resurrection. And so this is why people say you either pick 1 Circle of Priest or you go full Priest, because 1 Circle of Priest gives you the Resurrection, and there really isn't all that much after that, except for Stone Skin, which you get on Priest Circle 3. And then the last rank 2 class is the Krivis, and Krivis is not that great. I gotta admit, I think Krivis is very difficult to add to any build. And the reason for that is simply that Cleric Circle 1 is so strong no matter what your build is, and Priest Circle 1 is so good if you want to go for a support build. And so Krivis just kind of falls behind. There's one ability in Krivis that does make Krivis a very good class, but the problem is once again that this ability can be provided by a Pardoner. Pardoners in general, I must say, are a little bit of a detriment to a lot of the classes in Cleric. It is very difficult to justify classes like Krivis when their main pull is an ability that you can just buy from a crafter. Because are you going to waste one of your ranks that you could put into Cleric Circle 2 for that ability that you can buy for a couple of thousand silver from a guy in Klaipeda? I would argue most people are going to say no. But let's go over the abilities in detail. So the first ability is Aukurus, and Aukurus basically puts down a little flame that increases your health regeneration. The problem with this is that health regeneration doesn't actually really work all that well in combat. You get very, very, very tiny amounts of your health regeneration passively, and health regeneration only fully works when you are sitting down with your character. So what Aukurus really is a campfire upgrade. It is a very, very, very sad skill. Now, you can possibly justify putting 1 point into it because one of its attributes increases resistance to fire damage by 42 points, which isn't all that bad. But other than that, this skill is entirely useless because, as I said, it's a campfire upgrade. And you're a cleric, you're supposed to replace the campfire for swordsmen and archers that generally don't have any healing. The next ability is Zalkiai, and Zalkiai is not very exciting. One of its attributes does increase your spell damage dealt, so there can maybe perhaps be an argument made for a pure spell damage cleric to go for a rank of Krivis or 2, but then adding a bunch of heal circles from Cleric 2 is probably still better. And beyond that, it adds a not so great buff to your group, does a little bit of a debuff on an enemy if you can hit it well, but at least it's not Aukurus, so 5 points. Now Dino is the reason why you pick up Krivis. Dino increases the buff limit for the people in your group, and that is quite important because the buff limit is pretty restrictive and there are a lot of buffs in this game. But once again, like I said earlier, this can be provided by a pardoner. You can just go to Klaipeda and buy Dino for like 1,000, 2,000 silver tops. That might sound a lot early game, but early game you don't actually have that many buffs yet. It really only becomes a problem later, and then you just have so much money that you just buy Dino every time. So there simply isn't that much reason to pick up Krivis just for Dino, and everything else in Krivis just isn't that good. Just like lastly, we have Zybus, and Zybus is a decent damage ability, but it has a hit count instead of an AoE, which means even though it says it has a hit count of like 9 or 15 or whatever, it just hits single targets that many times. And so it's an okay skill, but it is not incredibly overwhelming, and it also means that enemies that you're trying to zap have to remain in the circle for them to actually take that damage. Alright, and now let's quickly talk about leveling. As soon as you have some money to your name, you should start buying the cheapest pardoner buffs you can find. Now the reason I say this is that with Blessing and Sacrament, you can actually start doing some rather decent melee damage. The problem with leveling as a cleric is that your heal and cure have rather significant cooldowns for early game abilities. And while they can absolutely deal with monsters, it does mean that you have these downtimes where you're smacking them with your mace, as you might be able to see in the background, and you're just not doing that much damage if you're going for an intelligence or spirit-focused cleric. For a strength-focused cleric, it's maybe not that important, but still you should pick up a Sacrament buff because it's just so crazy and increases your damage by so damn much. Beyond that, use your heal and cure spell well, pull mobs together so that you hit a lot of them at the same time. And if you're not going for pardoner buffs because you're cheap, then you should absolutely avoid flyers because they will ruin you. Your heal and cure spell do not hit flying targets, and as such you actually have to whack them down with your poopy little mace that doesn't do any damage. Lastly, we're going to take a quick look at attribute priority. For Cleric Circle 1, the very first thing you should get, and that goes for every single cleric build out there, is Heal Remove Damage. It's a very, very useful attribute that when you do take the role of the support of a group, you can just remove the damage so that the heal circles don't get used up by monsters and your group members can actually take them. And you should also get Heal Create Extra and Heal Enhance, because both of these are good upgrades for your heal spell. And your heal spell, it is bread and butter, it is just that good. And the same goes also for Safety Zone Increased Range. This is a one-off, so you should probably even get it before Heal Enhance. And it just makes the area in which people can stand to benefit from Safety Zone larger. And that is quite useful when there's a lot of stuff going on and people have a hard time finding the Safety Zone. After that, go for Cure Enhance and Cloth Mastery Magic. Because unless you're going for some kind of tanky melee cleric, you really don't need the physical defense buff. And should you go Cleric Circle 2, there's really only one specific one that you should get, and that is Safety Zone block count. This practically doubles the block count of Safety Zone and makes it an immensely powerful ability. Should you choose to go Priest, you really should focus on those blessing upgrades. Because you are going to use blessing so damn much in the early game, practically constantly, you absolutely should try to get the most out of blessing that you can. And so raising the attack count, getting the additional buffs in case you're in a group, and increasing the damage that blessing does is really quite good. Then you also want to add additional revive counts to resurrection so that the spell is more useful in a group situation. And then increase your weight limit because carrying more is also quite solid. Monstrance duration is just something you can pick up because, well, you have put points into Monstrance, so why not? And for all three of the Circle 2 classes, if you are planning to have different weapon sets for whatever reason, pick up Weapon Swap as well. Krivis is pretty simple, just pick up everything that makes Zalkiai not so damn useless, and that is most specifically the Magic Amplification. That Magic Amplification is what makes Zalkiai a rather useful ability for any spell damage focused cleric builds. Fire property resistance is a basic upgrade for the Krivis class and you should totally pick it up, just like Dino duration. Alright, and that is it for this basic cleric guide. I hope it was helpful to you in some way. And if you have any further questions or issues, do raise them in the comments. And I'm going to press gang my buddy Calcifar to answer them for you. Stay tuned for more Tree of Savior guides on this channel. And maybe even check out some of my other content like the Total Warhammer coverage that is about to begin. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey and I'll see you in another video.